She was 17 the last time she kissed him, and the taste of that kiss stayed on her lips for years. Salt and desperation, and the metallic bite of a winter morning in Devon, when the air is so cold it turns your breath into something visible, something you can watch leave your body and disappear. His name was Julian Ashford, and he was the second son of the Earl of Lyndhurst, which in 1808 meant he was a man with excellent manners, a good education, and no money whatsoever. The eldest son, George, Golden George, the heir, the one their father loved openly and without complication, would inherit the estate, the title, and the debts, which by that point were substantial. Julian would inherit a commission in the army or a living in the church, depending on which form of respectable poverty his family decided to assign him. But Julian wanted neither. What Julian wanted was to read books and argue about philosophy and walk along the Devon coastline with Elinor Sutherland, whose father rented the farm adjacent to the Ashford estate, and whose education, like her beauty, was far above her station. Elinor was the daughter of a tenant farmer who had once been a schoolteacher and who had never quite forgiven the world for demoting him. Her father, a quiet, meticulous man named Thomas Sutherland, had taught her to read before she could properly hold a spoon. He had taught her Greek and French and mathematics, and the particular skill of arguing a position you didn't believe in, which he considered the foundation of all genuine thinking. He had given her, in short, the kind of mind that a tenant farmer's daughter was not supposed to have, and then he had watched, with a mixture of pride and helplessness, as that mind made her life considerably more difficult than it needed to be. Because a clever woman in 1808 was a problem, not for herself. Elinor loved her own mind, loved the way it worked, loved the satisfying click of an argument falling into place, but for everyone around her. Clever women made men uncomfortable. Clever women of low birth made men of high birth very uncomfortable. And clever women of low birth who were also beautiful. Beautiful in the way Elinor was beautiful, not the porcelain perfection of a society portrait, but the warm, animated beauty of a face that was always thinking, were the most uncomfortable of all, because they were a temptation wrapped in an impossibility. Julian Ashford fell in love with her on a Tuesday afternoon in April when he was 20 and she was 16. He had come to the Sutherland farm to return a book he had borrowed from Thomas, a volume of Montaigne's essays that Thomas had annotated in the margins with observations so sharp they improved on the original. And Elinor had answered the door. She was wearing a blue dress that had been let out at the hem, and a smudge of ink on her left hand, and an expression of mild irritation that meant she had been interrupted in the middle of reading. Julian said something. He could never afterward remember what. And Elinor looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes and said, "You've had that book for 3 months. Did you read it, or use it to prop open a window?" He laughed. He laughed because no one spoke to him like that. Certainly no woman, certainly no tenant farmer's daughter. And the surprise of it cracked something open inside him. And what poured through the crack was a feeling so large and so immediate that he stood on the doorstep of a farm in Devon and felt the entire trajectory of his life shift. They became friends first, because friendship was permissible in a way that love was not. He came to the farm to borrow books from Thomas. He stayed to discuss them with Elinor. They walked along the coastal path, always within sight of the farm, always maintaining the fiction that their conversations were casual and incidental. And they talked about everything: philosophy and poetry, and the nature of duty, and the question of whether happiness was a right or a luxury, and whether a person could choose their own life, or whether life chose for you. Julian argued for freedom. Elinor argued for duty. This was ironic, given what came later, But at 17 and 20, they did not know what was coming. No one ever does. The friendship became love on a night in August when they were both at a harvest dance. A local affair, modest and loud, with fiddle music and cider and the particular recklessness that summer brings to young people who spend too much time thinking and not enough time acting. Julian asked Elinor to dance. She said yes. And somewhere during the second dance, a reel, fast and breathless, their hands gripping each other as the music spun, the pretense dropped. He pulled her close. She let him. And the look that passed between them was not friendship. It was the thing that friendship had been hiding, the fire beneath the civility, and once it was visible, it could not be made invisible again. They were careful. They met in secret, the copse of willows behind the church, the ruined chapel on the cliff, the small beach where the tide pools glinted in the sun. They talked and kissed and planned, because planning was what you did when the present was impossible, and the future was the only place your love could live. They would elope. That was the plan. Julian would take whatever money he could gather. It would not be much. And they would go to London, or perhaps to Edinburgh, where the marriage laws were more forgiving. He would find work. He was educated. He could tutor. He could clerk. He could write for the newspapers. It would not be the life his family expected of him, but it would be his. And Elinor would be in it. And that was enough. Elinor believed in the plan because she believed in Julian. And believing in Julian was the easiest thing she had ever done, easier than believing in God or mathematics or the inevitability of spring. He was the first person, other than her father, who treated her mind as a gift rather than a problem, and the first person who made her feel that being who she was, clever, opinionated, farm-born, ink-stained, was not something to be apologized for, but something to be celebrated. They set a date, the 15th of October. Julian would come to the farm at dawn, and they would take the coach to Exeter, and from Exeter they would take the mail coach to London, and by nightfall they would be beyond the reach of anyone who might try to stop them. On the 10th of October, George Ashford fell from his horse. It was a stupid death, the kind of death that seems, in retrospect, almost offensively arbitrary. George was an excellent rider. The horse was well trained. The ground was dry, the path familiar, the morning calm. But a pheasant broke from the hedgerow at precisely the wrong moment, and the horse shied, and George, distracted, perhaps thinking about the estate or his debts, or the woman in Bath he had been courting, failed to keep his seat. He struck his head on a stone wall. He was dead before the groom reached him. In a single moment, Julian Ashford went from being the irrelevant second son to the heir to the earldom of Lyndhurst. And the earldom of Lyndhurst, as Julian knew with terrible clarity, was a ruin. The debts were staggering. George had been a charming, generous, hopelessly irresponsible man who had spent money the way other people breathed, automatically, constantly, without thinking about where it came from. The estate owed money to banks, to merchants, to neighbouring landowners. The tenants, including Thomas Sutherland, had not received repairs to their farms in years. The roof of the main house leaked. The income from the land barely covered the interest on the loans, let alone the principal. Julian could walk away. He could let the estate collapse, let the creditors carve it up, let the tenants find other landlords, and the name of Ashford fade into the comfortable obscurity of a family that had once been something and was now nothing. He could take Elinor to London and live the life they had planned and let duty go to hell. But the tenants, the families who had farmed the Ashford land for generations, the people who depended on the estate for their homes, their livelihoods, their children's futures. Julian could not look at their faces, Thomas Sutherland's face, the face of the man whose daughter he loved, and say, "I am choosing my happiness over your survival." He told Elinor on the 12th of October, 3 days before they were supposed to elope. They met at the ruined chapel on the cliff. The sea was rough that day, grey and heaving, throwing itself against the rocks with a fury that felt personal. And the wind was sharp, and Elinor was wearing a green shawl that she pulled tight around her shoulders, as if it could protect her from what was coming. Julian told her about the debts. He told her about the tenants. He told her about the only solution that the family solicitor could see: a marriage to an heiress, a woman with a fortune large enough to absorb the estate's debts and provide the capital for restoration. The solicitor had already identified a candidate, Miss Arabella Thorne, the only daughter of a textile magnate in Manchester, who had been raised with the explicit understanding that her father's money would buy her a title. "I am going to do something terrible," Julian said. "I am going to marry a woman I do not love, and I am asking you to forgive me for it." Elinor was quiet for a long time. The wind pulled at her shawl. The sea roared. A gull screamed overhead with the pointless urgency of a creature that does not understand human suffering. Then she said, "Do your duty." The words were steady. Her voice was steady. Everything about her was steady. And Julian, who knew her better than anyone alive, understood that the steadiness was a structure she had built in the last 30 seconds to keep herself from collapsing, and that beneath it she was falling apart. "Wait for me," he said. "I'll find a way. Once the estate is stable, once the debts are manageable, Don't. Don't ask me to wait. Don't make me a woman who waits. Elinor, if you ask me to wait, I will. You know I will. And it will ruin me. Not because I'm not strong enough, but because waiting is a poison. It stops you from living. It turns the present into nothing. Just a space between now and something that might never come." She was right. She knew she was right. And Julian knew she was right. Which made it worse. Because the truth of what she was saying did not change the fact that he wanted to say it anyway. "Wait. Please wait. I cannot bear the thought of you moving on." But he did not say it. Or rather, he said something that contained it without stating it. "I have to go to Australia," he said. "There's an investment opportunity, a scheme involving the penal colonies, land grants, exports. If it works, it could generate enough income to pay the debts faster. 5 years, the solicitor says. 5 years, and the estate will be solvent. 5 years. And in the meantime, I'll marry Miss Thorne. By proxy. The ceremony can be conducted while I'm at sea. The money will begin flowing into the estate immediately." Elinor absorbed this. She was calculating. Julian could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the same way he could see her father's calculations when Thomas was working through a mathematical problem. She was computing the distance, the time, the probabilities. She was measuring the gap between what she wanted and what was possible, and finding it unbridgeable. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow." The word dropped between them like a stone into water, a small, hard, irrevocable thing that sent ripples in every direction. "Tomorrow," she repeated. "The ship sails from Plymouth at noon. Then we have tonight." They had tonight. They walked along the coastal path in the fading light, and they did not talk about the future because the future was a country they could not enter, and they did not talk about the past because the past was too sweet and too painful. So they talked about nothing and everything: the colour of the sea, the shape of the clouds, the way the light hit the cliffs at this hour and turned the stone gold. At the ruined chapel, Elinor stopped. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a letter. It was small, folded twice, sealed with a plain wafer, not wax, because Elinor did not own a seal. She pressed it into Julian's hand. "Open it when you arrive," she said. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. Her face was the face he had fallen in love with. Dark eyes, sharp jaw, the expression of a woman who was thinking three things at once and showing none of them. "What does it say?" "You'll know when you read it." He tucked the letter into his coat. They kissed. The last kiss. The one that tasted of salt and desperation and cold Devon air. And then she pulled away and said, "Go. If you stay another minute, I'll ask you not to leave, and we'll both be ruined." He went. He walked away from the ruined chapel and down the cliff path and across the fields to the Ashford house. And he did not look back, because Elinor had taught him, in all those conversations about philosophy and duty and the nature of courage, that looking back was for people who had not yet decided to go forward. The ship was called the Endurance. It was a brig, a two-masted sailing vessel, sturdy and unremarkable, and it left Plymouth at noon on the 13th of October, 1808, carrying 40 passengers, a cargo of manufactured goods, and Julian Ashford, the new Earl of Lyndhurst, who stood at the stern rail and watched England shrink to a line on the horizon and thought, "I have lost everything that matters." In his coat pocket, the letter waited. He did not open it. Not that day, not that week, not during the 4-month voyage to New South Wales. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. A quiet evening, a calm sea, a state of mind in which he could receive whatever Elinor had written without being destroyed by it. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. He was afraid. He was afraid the letter said she loved him. He was afraid that reading those words, "I love you," in Elinor's careful handwriting, would make it impossible to do what he had to do. The Proxy marriage was scheduled for the 3rd week of the voyage. A clergyman aboard the ship would conduct the ceremony with Julian present and Arabella represented by the ship's captain standing in her place. It was a legal arrangement, cold and transactional, and Julian could endure it as long as he did not allow himself to feel anything. Elinor's letter, if it said what he feared it said, would make him feel everything. And feeling everything would make the marriage unbearable, and the marriage was the only thing standing between the estate and ruin, between the tenants and homelessness, between Thomas Sutherland and the loss of the farm where his daughter had grown up. So Julian placed the letter in a tin box and closed the lid and put the box at the bottom of his trunk, and he did not open it. The Proxy marriage took place on a Wednesday afternoon in November, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The clergyman read the words. Julian said, "I do," to a woman he had never met, represented by a sea captain with a red beard and a chronic cough. The document was signed. The thing was done. That night, in his cabin, Julian drank an entire bottle of brandy and stared at the tin box and did not open it. The voyage to New South Wales took 4 months. Julian spent them reading, drinking, and avoiding conversation with the other passengers, who found him puzzling. A young earl travelling alone to the colonies, without servants, without entourage, with a tin box he never opened and a habit of standing at the stern rail for hours, watching the wake. He arrived in Sydney in February of 1809. The colony was raw and chaotic, a jumble of convict labour, military authority, and mercantile ambition, all hammered together under a sky so wide and so blue that it seemed like a different sky entirely, belonging to a different world. Julian threw himself into the work. The investment scheme, a combination of land grants, or sheep farming, and wool exports, required his presence and his capital, and he gave both with the desperate energy of a man who needed to be busy in order not to think. He did not open the letter. Back in England, Elinor began to write. She began on the 15th of October, the day they were supposed to elope. She sat at the small desk in her bedroom, the desk her father had built from oak planks, salvaged from a barn, and she opened her inkwell and took out a sheet of paper and wrote, "Dear Julian." And then she stopped. Because what do you say to a man who has left you? Not abandoned. She did not think of it as abandonment because she had told him to go, but left, gone, sailed to the other side of the world, married another woman, entered a life that had no room for a tenant farmer's daughter with ink on her hands. She stared at the blank page for a long time. Then she wrote, "The crocuses are late this year. Father says it's the cold, but I think they're just being cautious. Sensible flowers, crocuses. They know that arriving too early means getting caught in the frost." She folded the letter. She addressed it to Julian Ashford, Earl of Lyndhurst, care of the Colonial Office, Sydney, New South Wales. She did not expect it to reach him. The post to Australia was unreliable at best. Letters were carried on merchant ships, transferred at Cape Town or Calcutta, lost, damaged, delivered months or years late. Sending a letter to New South Wales was less like communication and more like prayer. An act of faith directed at a destination you could not see. But she wrote it, and the next day she wrote another, and the next day another. She wrote every day. Not long letters. She was not writing novels. Some days it was a paragraph, some days a sentence. She described the weather, the garden, the books she was reading. She described the way the light fell on the hills in the evening, and the sound of the church bells on Sunday morning, and the particular smell of her father's study, which was old paper and pipe tobacco, and the faint, persistent mustiness of a room where thinking happened. She did not write love letters, not after the first week. The first few letters were raw, aching, desperate, full of the things she had not let herself say at the ruined chapel. "I miss you. I love you. I cannot breathe without you." But she read them back and heard the sound of a woman who was not living, who was merely waiting, and she remembered what she had told him. Waiting is a poison. It stops you from living. So she stopped writing love letters and started writing life letters. She wrote about what she saw and what she thought and what she felt. Not about Julian, but about the world he was missing. She wrote about the old woman in the village who could predict rain by the behavior of her cat. She wrote about the new novel she had read and the argument she had about it with the vicar's wife. She wrote about the first snowfall and the last rose, and the way the sea looked at dawn when the light turned it into hammered silver. She was building something. She did not know it at first. But as the weeks became months and the months became seasons, she began to understand what she was doing. She was building an architecture of presence. Each letter was a brick, and the structure they formed was not a bridge to Julian. She had given up on bridges, but a house made of days, a record of a life being lived, set down on paper, sent into the void. She was writing to be heard. Not by Julian, necessarily. By someone. By anyone. By the universe itself, which seemed, most of the time, to be paying no attention whatsoever. A year passed. Elinor was 18. Her father's health was declining. The same cough that had plagued him for years was worsening, settling deeper into his lungs, stealing his breath and his weight. She nursed him and managed the farm, and continued to write her daily letters, which she stored in a wooden box under her bed when she could not afford the postage, and posted in batches when she could. She received no reply. This did not surprise her. She had calculated the logistics. A letter to Australia and a reply back might take 8 months or more, assuming both letters survived the journey, and Julian might not reply even if he received them. He was married. He had a duty. Writing back to the woman he had left behind was not part of that duty. But the absence of a reply did something to the letters themselves. It freed them. Without the expectation of response, Elinor could write anything. She could be honest in a way that conversation, even conversation with Julian, even at their most intimate, had never permitted. She could say the things that people think but do not speak, because speaking them would make them real, and some things are too heavy to be made real in the presence of another person. She wrote about her fear that her father was dying. She wrote about the loneliness that came in the evenings, when the farm was quiet and the sky was dark, and she sat by the fire with a book in her lap and no one to discuss it with. She wrote about the slow, grinding realization that her life, this particular life on this particular farm, in this particular corner of Devon, was going to be smaller than she had imagined, and that the process of accepting that smallness was not a single event, but a daily practice, like prayer or exercise, something you had to do over and over until it became tolerable. She wrote about Julian too, but differently now, not as a lover, as a memory. She wrote about the way he used to tilt his head when he was thinking, as if the thought were physically heavy and he needed to adjust his balance. She wrote about the way he laughed, suddenly, unexpectedly, a burst of sound that always surprised him as much as the person who had provoked it. She wrote about the afternoon they had spent in the ruined chapel, reading Montaigne aloud to each other, arguing about whether experience or reason was a more reliable guide to truth, and how Julian had said, "Experience, obviously," and Elinor had said, "Reason, obviously." And they had both been wrong, because the answer was neither. The answer was the person you trusted enough to argue with. She was memorializing him, preserving him in amber, the way a naturalist preserves a specimen. Not the living creature, but the shape of it, the essential characteristics, the details that made it itself. She was doing this because she sensed, even then, that the Julian she remembered would not be the Julian who returned, if he returned at all. Time would change him. Australia would change him. The marriage and the debts and the weight of the title would change him. The man she loved was already gone, and what she was doing with her letters was building a monument to the person he had been. 2 years passed. Her father died. It was a long, slow, terrible death, the consumption taking him in stages, like a tide going out, each withdrawal revealing more of the barren shore beneath. Elinor held his hand at the end. He looked at her with the same quiet, meticulous attention he had brought to everything, his teaching, his farming, his annotated copy of Montaigne. And he said, "You have the best mind I ever encountered. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She buried him in the churchyard and put flowers on his grave every Sunday and wrote a letter to Julian that said simply, "See, he is gone. The only person who ever loved me without reservation, and I am alone now, truly alone, and I do not know how to bear it." She bore it. She bore it because bearing things was what Elinor did, not with grace, not with serenity, but with the stubborn, unglamorous persistence of a woman who had been taught that the alternative to going forward was standing still. And standing still was a form of dying. The farm could not sustain her alone. A woman running a farm without a husband or a father was a curiosity in 1810, Devon. Not impossible, but impractical, subject to the whims of landlords and the calculations of neighbours who saw a single woman as either an opportunity or an obstacle. The new estate manager, appointed by Julian's solicitors, who were running the Ashford lands in the Earl's absence, was a hard, efficient man who had no interest in sentimentality. He told Elinor that the farm needed a tenant who could work it properly, and that she was welcome to stay if she could find a husband. She found one. Not because she wanted to, but because survival and desire rarely align, and a woman in her position could not afford to be particular. His name was Dr. William Hale. He was 32, the physician who had attended her father during his final illness, and he was, there is no kinder word for it, ordinary. He was competent, conscientious, and kind in a way that was genuine but limited, like a fire that gives heat but not light. He did not read philosophy. He did not argue about Montaigne. He discussed his patients and the weather and the price of grain. And he was content with these subjects in a way that made Elinor feel simultaneously grateful and suffocated. He loved her. That was clear. He loved her with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who had found someone beautiful and intelligent and could not quite believe his luck. He did not understand her entirely. He did not understand the letters she wrote every evening, the box under the bed, the faraway look that sometimes came over her face when the light hit the hills a certain way. But he did not demand understanding. He was satisfied with proximity. They married in the spring of 1811. Elinor wore a white dress that had been her mother's, and she stood in the church where she had been christened and said the words that bound her to a man she did not love, and she felt not nothing, but something muted. A door closing. Not the dramatic slam of a door in a storm, but the quiet click of a door closing in an empty house where there is no one to hear it. She continued to write to Julian every day. She told William they were letters to a cousin in London, a lie so mundane and so unverifiable that William accepted it without question. She wrote at her desk in the evenings, while William read his medical journals in the chair by the fire, and the scratch of her pen on paper became the soundtrack of their marriage, a persistent, private sound that William associated with Elinor's correspondence and never investigated further. She told Julian about the wedding. She described it simply, without drama. I married a doctor named William Hale. He is kind. He does not make me think, but he makes me safe. And I have learned that safety is not nothing. Or it is not everything, but it is not nothing. She told him about the house William rented, a modest but pleasant house on the edge of the village, with a garden where Elinor planted roses and a study where she kept her books. She told him about the first winter, when the snow came early and heavy, and William worked 18-hour days treating patients with influenza, and Elinor sat by the fire and read Seneca, and wrote letters to a man on the other side of the world, and felt the strangeness of her double life, the visible life of a doctor's wife, and the invisible life of a woman still tethered to a ghost. She told him when she became pregnant. She described the sickness, the swelling, the peculiar sensation of carrying another life inside her body. A sensation that was, she wrote, both miraculous and mundane, like everything else that happens to human beings. She told him when the child was born, a girl named Alice, with William's square face and Elinor's dark eyes. She described the feeling of holding a newborn, the warmth, the weight, the terrifying fragility. And she wrote, I thought I would feel guilty, bringing a child into a marriage built on a lie. But Alice does not know about the lie. She knows only that she is warm and fed and held, and that is enough for now. Perhaps it will always be enough. I hope so. A second child followed, a boy named Thomas, after her father. And then a third, another girl, Margaret, who arrived in 1815 and completed the family in a way that William found satisfying and Elinor found bewildering, because she had not expected this fullness, this ordinary, a domestic fullness that had nothing to do with passion or philosophy or the grand love affair she had imagined at 17. She was happy. She could admit that now, in the letters, if nowhere else. She was happy in the way that people are happy when they have stopped expecting happiness to look a particular way. It was not the happiness she had planned. It was not the happiness she would have chosen. But it was real, and it was hers, and she had earned it, day by day, letter by letter, through the patient, unglamorous work of building a life from the materials at hand. The letters changed as she changed. The passionate girl of the first year, the girl who wrote "I Cannot Breathe Without You," became the young wife who wrote about gardens and pregnancies and the small comedies of village life. The young wife became the mother who wrote about Alice's first words and Thomas's first steps and Margaret's habit of falling asleep with her fist in her mouth. The mother became the matron, a woman in her late 20s, then her early 30s, who wrote with the measured wisdom of someone who had lived enough to know that most of what we call tragedy is simply life refusing to cooperate with our plans. She was aging on the page. Julian, if he ever read the letters, would watch her grow old in real time, a time lapse of a human life, compressed into ink and paper, one day at a time. In Australia, Julian was not reading the letters. He was not reading them because they were not arriving. Most of them, anyway. The postal system between England and New South Wales was a catastrophe of lost ships, misdirected mail, and bureaucratic incompetence, and of the hundreds of letters Elinor sent over the years, only a fraction made the journey. Those that did arrive were delivered to Julian's address in Sydney, where they were placed on his desk by a servant, and Julian, who saw Elinor's handwriting on the first envelope and felt his chest constrict as if a hand had closed around his heart, placed them in the tin box without opening them. The box grew heavier. Week by week, month by month, the letters accumulated. A physical weight that Julian carried with him from his first lodgings in Sydney to a farmhouse in the Blue Mountains, to a larger property in the Hunter Valley, where the wool business was beginning to produce the returns his solicitor had promised. The box sat on his desk, and Julian did not open it. And the reason was the same reason he had not opened the first letter on the ship. He was afraid. He was afraid that the letters would contain love, and love would make his life unbearable. His marriage to Arabella was already unbearable enough. The Proxy ceremony had been followed, upon his eventual return to England for a brief visit in 1811, by an actual meeting with his wife, and the meeting had confirmed what Julian had suspected. Arabella Thorne was a shrewd, practical, deeply unhappy woman who had married a title and received a man, and was unsatisfied with the exchange. She was not cruel. Julian would grant her that. She was not the villainess of a Gothic novel. She did not scheme or manipulate or rage. She was simply cold. Cold in the way that people become when they have been raised to treat relationships as transactions, when love has never been modelled for them, when the only warmth they have known has come with a price tag. She managed the household. She managed the finances. She managed Julian with the same efficiency she brought to everything, scheduling his meals, organising his correspondence, ensuring that the appearance of a functional marriage was maintained even as the reality behind it withered. Julian drank. Not at first. At first he threw himself into the colonial enterprise with the same desperate energy he had brought to Australia originally, working long hours, travelling between properties, immersing himself in the business of wool and land. But the work was numbing rather than fulfilling, and the numbness wore off in the evenings, when he sat in his study in the house Arabella had furnished with taste and money and no love whatsoever. And the silence pressed in, and the tin box sat on the desk, and the brandy decanter beckoned. He drank the way lonely men drink, steadily, methodically, not to celebrate or to forget, but to blur the edges of a present that was too sharp. He drank alone, in his study, with the door closed and the tin box in front of him, and sometimes his hand would reach for the box, and his fingers would touch the lid, and he would think, "Tonight. I will open them tonight." And then the fear would come, that cold, paralyzing wave, and he would reach for the brandy instead. Years passed. The colonial scheme succeeded. The wool exports generated substantial income. The debts were being paid. The estate in Devon was slowly recovering. Julian should have been satisfied. He had done what he set out to do. The tenants were secure. The name of Ashford was no longer a synonym for ruin. He had sacrificed his happiness for duty, and duty had been fulfilled. But duty, once fulfilled, leaves a vacancy. The thing that had driven Julian, the urgent, all-consuming need to save the estate, was gone, and what replaced it was nothing. A void. The particular emptiness of a man who has achieved his goal and discovered that the goal was not the same as the purpose, and that purpose, once lost, is very difficult to recover. He and Arabella returned to England in 1815. They settled in the Ashford estate, which had been repaired and restored in their absence, and they lived there in a state of mutual tolerance that was worse than hostility, because hostility at least implied engagement. They ate meals together and attended church together and spoke to each other with the mechanical politeness of strangers sharing a carriage. And at night, Julian sat in his study with the tin box and the brandy and the growing, gnawing certainty that he had made the wrong choice. Not about the marriage had been necessary, but about the letter, about the box, about the 15 years. It was 15 years now, 15 years since Elinor had pressed that first letter into his hand at the ruined chapel, of unopened correspondence that sat on his desk like an accusation. He could not open them because opening them meant confronting what he had lost. And confronting what he had lost meant feeling it. And feeling it meant what? Collapse. Madness. The complete unraveling of the person he had constructed to survive the life he had chosen? Perhaps. Perhaps that was exactly what it meant. And Julian, who had survived Australia and debt and a loveless marriage and the slow erosion of his own personality by alcohol and loneliness, was not sure he could survive that. Arabella found the box in the autumn of 1822. Julian was away, a trip to London, ostensibly on business, actually on brandy. And Arabella, who was conducting one of her periodic reorganizations of the household, entered his study and found the tin box on the desk. It was not locked. Julian had never locked it, because locking it would have implied that the contents were valuable, and acknowledging their value would have been a form of opening them. Arabella opened the box. She found dozens of letters, it all in the same handwriting, all addressed to Julian. She took one from the middle of the stack, neither the earliest nor the latest, a letter from somewhere in the middle of the 15-year span. And she broke the seal and read it. She had expected passion. She had expected confession, desperation, the heated outpourings of an illicit affair. She had braced herself for jealousy, the cold, controlled jealousy of a woman who did not love her husband, but who considered him her property nonetheless. What she found was something else entirely. The letter described the first crocuses of spring. It described them in detail. The colour, which was not simply purple, but a particular shade that hovered between purple and blue, like the sky at the moment just before full dark. The way they pushed through the half-frozen soil with a determination that seemed Elinor wrote, almost aggressive, as if they were personally offended by winter and intended to make their feelings known. The way they looked in the morning light, beaded with dew, each droplet catching the sun and throwing it back in tiny, perfect prisms. That was all. No declarations of love, no pleas for reunion, no mention of Julian by name. Just a woman describing flowers. Arabella read the letter 3 times. Then she sat at Julian's desk, in Julian's chair, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Not jealousy, not anger, but a kind of awe. Not for the flowers, for the woman who had written about them. For the quality of attention that the letter revealed, the capacity to look at the world, really look at it, and find it worthy of description. For the particular kind of love that expressed itself not in passion, but in noticing. In the daily, faithful act of paying attention to the ordinary and setting it down on paper. Arabella had never received a letter like that. She had never received a letter that was not a transaction, a request, a demand, an invoice, a social obligation. She had never known that a letter could be a gift, that words on paper could be a form of companionship, offered freely, expected nothing in return. She opened another letter, and another, and another. She read 12 letters that afternoon, spanning 3 years, and each one was the same, and each one was different. The same faithful attention, the same quiet devotion, the same woman living her life and writing it down and sending it into the void. And then Arabella did something that surprised even herself. She wrote back. She wrote as Julian. She had seen his handwriting on enough documents to imitate it passably, not perfectly, but close enough to fool someone who wanted to be fooled. She wrote a short letter, restrained and distant, the kind of letter that a man married to another woman might write to a former attachment. Not encouraging, not cruel, but present, acknowledging receipt, acknowledging the crocuses, acknowledging, in the most oblique way possible, the existence of the woman who had written. She posted the letter to the address on Elinor's most recent envelope, a house in the village of Ashford, Devon, where the doctor's wife lived with her husband and her children, and her daily practice of writing to a man who never wrote back. 6 weeks later, a reply arrived. It was from Elinor, addressed to Julian, and it was, like all her letters, a description of a day. This day happened to include a robin that had built a nest in the hedge outside the kitchen window, and the way Alice, who was now 11, sat on a stool every morning to watch the eggs, counting them, checking for cracks, whispering encouragement that the bird could not possibly hear. Arabella read the letter and felt, for the first time in her marriage, that she understood something about Julian. Not the Julian she lived with, the distant, drinking, hollow man who occupied the other end of the dining table and the other side of the bed. The Julian that Elinor wrote to. The Julian who had been worth waiting for. The Julian who had inspired a woman to write every day for a decade without any expectation of reply. That Julian was gone. Arabella knew it. She lived with the ruin of him daily. But the Julian in Elinor's letters was still alive, preserved in ink, maintained by devotion, kept breathing by the sheer, stubborn persistence of a woman who refused to stop writing. Arabella continued the correspondence. She wrote to Elinor once a month, restrained, careful letters, always in imitation of Julian's hand, always maintaining the fiction that Julian was the one writing. The letters were not affectionate. They were not warm. They were, if anything, the letters of a man who was slowly, gently, releasing a woman from her devotion, not telling her to stop writing, but ceasing to give her a reason to continue. They were letters of distance, of withdrawal, of the quiet closing of a door. Elinor received them. She read them, and she knew. She knew immediately. Not because the handwriting was wrong. It was close enough. And she had not seen Julian's hand in so long that the memory had blurred. She knew because the letters did not sound like Julian. Julian would have argued with her. Julian would have responded to her descriptions with descriptions of his own. Julian would have engaged, because engagement was what Julian did. It was the quality she had loved most about him, the inability to let a thought pass without examining it, turning it over, testing it against his own. These letters did not engage. They acknowledged. They were the letters of a stranger performing a kindness, releasing Elinor, letting her go, giving her permission to stop. Elinor could have been angry. She could have confronted the deception, demanded to know who was writing, exposed the fraud. But she did not. Because the truth she had understood for years, perhaps always, was that she was not writing to Julian. She had not been writing to Julian for a long time. She was writing to the act of writing itself, to the discipline of noticing, to the daily practice of paying attention to a world that did not care whether she noticed it or not, and describing it anyway, because the act of description was an act of love. And love, real love, the kind that sustains, does not require a recipient. It requires only a practice. She wrote back to the person she knew was not Julian. She continued her daily letters. She described the weather and the garden and the children and the books and the small, persistent, unremarkable beauty of a life lived in full. And she sent these descriptions to an address in Devon, where a woman she had never met read them and was, in her own quiet way, changed by them. Arabella died in the spring of 1823. Consumption, the same disease that had killed Elinor's father, the great equalizer, indifferent to title or wealth. She died in her bedroom in the Ashford house, with Julian beside her, not holding her hand, because they had never held hands, but present, which was the most they had ever managed. Before she died, she did two things. She told Julian about the correspondence. She told him that she had read Elinor's letters and written back, and that Elinor knew, and that the letters had been, for Arabella, the closest thing to genuine human connection she had experienced in her marriage. She said this without accusation. She was past accusation, past anger, past everything except the bare, stripped-down honesty that death imposes. She wrote about crocuses, Arabella said, and I understood for the first time why you loved her. Julian sat beside his dying wife and listened, and the thing he felt was not guilt or anger or grief. It was shame, the deep, corrosive shame of a man who has been given something precious, a wife, a correspondent, a woman who wrote every day for 15 years, and has wasted all of it. He had wasted Arabella's life by not loving her. He had wasted Elinor's devotion by not reading her letters. He had wasted his own years by drinking them away, one brandy at a time, in a study where the evidence of love sat in a tin box on his desk, unexamined, unacknowledged, unearned. The second thing Arabella did, before she died, was tell him to open the box. "Read them," she said. "All of them. You owe her that." Arabella died on a Wednesday afternoon. Julian arranged the funeral. He received the condolences. He performed the rituals that society required. The mourning clothes, the black armband, the appropriate expressions of loss. And then, on a Thursday night, 2 weeks after the funeral, he sat down at his desk and opened the tin box. There were over 5,000 letters, 15 years of daily writing, stacked in bundles tied with ordinary string. Not ribbon, not silk, but string. because Elinor was not a woman who wasted money on decoration when function would serve. The bundles were arranged chronologically, the earliest at the bottom, the most recent at the top. Julian began at the beginning. The first letter was dated the 15th of October, 1808, the day they were supposed to elope. He read it, and the handwriting was so achingly familiar that for a moment he was 20 years old again, standing on a doorstep in Devon, watching a girl with ink on her hand change the course of his life. He read through the night. He read the passionate letters of the first year, the raw, desperate outpourings of a girl whose heart was breaking. He read the transition, the moment when the tone shifted, when the love letters became life letters, when Elinor stopped writing to Julian and started writing to the world. He read about her father's death. He read about her marriage to William. He read about the pregnancies, the births, the children growing up in sentences and paragraphs, Alice's first words, Thomas's first steps, Margaret sleeping with her fist in her mouth. He read the Crocuses letter, the one Arabella had opened, and he understood why it had affected his wife so deeply, because the crocuses were not just crocuses. They were proof that someone was paying attention, that in a world full of noise and distraction and despair, one woman was sitting at a desk every evening, looking at the day she had just lived and finding it worthy of record. He read about the robin's nest, about the village fair, about a thunderstorm in August that split an oak tree in the churchyard, and Elinor's reflection that lightning, like grief, strikes once and changes the landscape permanently. He read about William, kind, boring William, who brought Elinor tea every evening and never asked about the letters, and loved her with a devotion that was, Elinor wrote, both sufficient and insufficient, like a coat that keeps you warm, but is not the colour you would have chosen. He read about William's death. It had happened in 1820, 3 years ago, a fever, quick and merciless, that took the doctor in the space of a week. Elinor described the funeral with the same precise, observational eye she brought to everything. She described the church and the hymns and the faces of the mourners. And then she wrote, "I did not love him the way I loved you, but I loved him. And the two kinds of love are not competitors. They are neighbours. They live side by side in different houses, and they nod to each other across the fence. And they do not ask questions about each other's business." Julian put the letter down and wept. Not for William, whom he had never met. Not for himself, though he had reason enough. He wept for the woman who had written those words, the woman who had taken the wreckage of her life and built from it something honest and beautiful and enduring. He wept because she had done it without him, because she had not needed him, because the love she had offered, 15 years of daily letters, a cathedral of attention, had not been contingent on his response. She had loved him freely, without condition or expectation, and that freedom was the most generous thing he had ever received, and the thing he least deserved. He read through the night and into the morning. He read until the candle burned down and the dawn crept through the study window and the servants began to stir in the kitchen below. He read 5,000 letters in 8 hours, and by the time he finished, he was not the same person who had started. He was older, and not in years. 8 hours does not age a man's body, but in understanding, in the accumulated weight of another person's life, absorbed all at once, pressing down on him with the gravity of everything he had missed. He sat in the morning light, surrounded by letters, and he looked at the tin box, now empty, and he saw something at the bottom that he had not noticed before. The first letter. Elinor's original letter, the one she had given him at the ruined chapel, the one he had placed in the box on the ship and never opened. It was still there, still sealed, the plain wafer intact after 15 years. He picked it up. He turned it over. He held it in hands that were shaking, not from drink, for once, but from the weight of the moment. This letter was the beginning. Everything that had followed, the voyage, the marriage, the box, to the silence, the 5,000 unanswered letters, had radiated from this single sealed object like ripples from a stone dropped in water. He did not open it, not yet, because he understood finally that the letter was not for him to open alone. It belonged to the space between them, the space that had been filled with 15 years of paper and silence and the stubborn, magnificent love of a woman who wrote every day to a man who never wrote back. He packed a bag. He called for a carriage. He placed the letter in his coat pocket, the same pocket where he had carried it on the ship 15 years ago, and he left the Ashford estate. The journey to the village took 4 hours. It was a journey he could have made in his sleep, the lanes and hedgerows and stone walls of Devon unchanged in his absence, as permanent and indifferent as the landscape of a dream. He watched them pass through the carriage window, and he thought about all the things Elinor had described in her letters. The crocuses, the robins, the thunderstorms, the light on the hills. And he realized that he was seeing them for the first time, even though he had grown up here. He was seeing them through her eyes, and her eyes were better than his. They saw more. They noticed more. They loved more. The village had changed, not dramatically. Villages in Devon did not change dramatically, but in small, accumulating ways. The blacksmith's shop had been replaced by a draper's. The old pub had a new sign. The church had been repainted. And on the high street, where there had once been a haberdasher's, there was now a bookshop. The sign above the door said Sutherland Books. Julian stood outside for a long time. He looked at the display in the window, a careful arrangement of volumes, some new, some second-hand, all positioned with the kind of attention that suggested someone who loved books, not as merchandise, but as objects, as companions, as the physical manifestation of human thought. He went inside. The shop was small and warm, and smelled of paper and dust, and the faint, sweet scent of old leather bindings. The shelves were crowded but organized, not alphabetically, not by subject, but by some private system that made sense to the person who had arranged them, a system based on association and mood rather than category. Fiction sat next to philosophy. Poetry sat next to natural history. It was the kind of arrangement that invited browsing rather than searching, that said, "But you may not find what you're looking for, but you will find something better." A woman stood behind the counter. She was 52. Her hair, which had been dark, was silver now, not the dull grey of age, but a bright, striking silver that caught the light from the window and seemed to glow. Her face was lined. 15 years of life, of children and grief and work, and the particular erosion of a face that has spent decades outdoors in the Devon wind. But the lines were not marks of damage. They were marks of use. They were the evidence of a face that had been fully lived in, every expression exhausted, every muscle employed. Her hands were stained with ink, even now, even at 52. Even as a bookseller and a widow and a mother of 3 grown children. She still had ink on her hands, because she still wrote every day, though she no longer posted the letters. She wrote them and placed them in the box under the counter, the same box she had kept since she was 17, because the practice was the point. The practice of noticing, the practice of paying attention, the practice of love. She looked up when the bell above the door chimed, and she saw a man standing in the entrance of her shop. He was 55, thin in a way that suggested illness or neglect. with grey hair and the particular complexion of someone who had spent too many years in the sun and too many evenings with a brandy glass. His eyes were the same eyes she had looked into at a harvest dance when she was 17, the same eyes that had watched her from the stern rail of a ship as England disappeared. They looked at each other. The shop was very quiet. A clock ticked on the wall. A cat, a marmalade Tom named Seneca, because Elinor named everything after philosophers, dozed on a stack of books by the window. The dust motes drifted in the afternoon light, and the world held its breath. Julian reached into his coat. He produced the letter, the first letter, the one from the ruined chapel, still sealed after 15 years. He held it out to her the way a man might hold out a map to someone he has asked for directions, the gesture of a person who is lost. "I couldn't open it," he said. His voice was rough, not with drink, with something else, with the effort of speaking words that had been locked inside him for 15 years. "I was afraid it would say you loved me. I knew if I read it, I couldn't keep you. I couldn't go through with the marriage, the duty, any of it. So I kept it sealed. And I kept your letters sealed. And I—" His voice broke. He stopped. He tried again. "I read them, all of them, last night. 5,000 letters. And I—" He stopped again. Because what do you say? What words exist for the experience of reading 15 years of someone's life in a single night? For watching a woman grow from a girl into a mother, into a widow, into the silver-haired keeper of a bookshop, all in the space of 8 hours? For understanding, finally and completely, that the love you were offered was the most extraordinary thing that would ever happen to you, and that you did not deserve it, and that your failure to receive it was the defining catastrophe of your existence? There are no words for that. There are only letters, 5,000 of them, stacked in bundles, tied with string. Elinor looked at the sealed letter in his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the man he had become, older, damaged, diminished. And she looked past him, to the man he had been, the man in her letters, the man she had preserved in amber for 15 years. They were not the same person. She had always known they would not be the same person. That was the point of the letters. The letters had been a monument to a man who no longer existed, a record of a love that had been transformed by time and distance into something else, something that was not less than love, something that was more. She came around the counter. She stood in front of Julian, close enough to touch, though she did not touch him. She took the letter from his hand. She looked at it. This small, folded piece of paper that had travelled to Australia and back, that had sat in a tin box for 15 years, that had outlasted a marriage and a death and a 5,000-letter vigil. She broke the seal. She unfolded the paper. She read aloud, in a voice that was steady and clear, the words she had written at 17. "Whatever happens, do not wait for me. Live." The words hung in the air between them. The clock ticked. The cat shifted in its sleep. The dust motes drifted. Julian closed his eyes. The sound he made was very small. A breath, a collapse, the sound of a man who has been holding something up for 15 years and finally lets it drop. "You told me not to wait," he said. "And I didn't wait. I married her. I went to Australia. I did everything except live." "I know." "And you did live. You lived every day. I read it. 5,000 days, Elinor. 5,000 days of living. And I missed every one of them. Yes. Can I—" He stopped. His eyes were open now, and they were wet, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not hope. He had lost the right to hope, but something adjacent to it, a request, a question. "No," she said. And the word was not hard. It was not cruel. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 15 years learning the difference between love and need, between devotion and dependence, between holding on and letting go. I followed my own advice, Julian. I lived. I am living. And the woman who wrote that letter, the girl who loved you at the ruined chapel, she is not here anymore. I am here. And I am someone you don't know. He stood in the middle of the bookshop and absorbed this, the finality of it, the gentleness of it, the absolute, unappealable truth of it. Then let me know you, he said. She looked at him for a long time. The light from the window lit the silver in her hair, and the ink on her hands, and the lines around her eyes. And she was not the girl he remembered. And that was not a loss. It was a transformation, and the woman she had become was more interesting, more complex, more real than the memory he had been carrying. "You can sit," she said. "There." She pointed to a chair in the corner of the shop, a comfortable chair beside a stack of books, and a small table where a teacup already sat, as if waiting. "You can read. I have 5,000 letters you never opened. You've read them once in a night. Now read them properly, one at a time, the way they were written." He sat. She went back behind the counter, and the bell above the door chimed as a customer entered, a woman looking for a birthday gift for her daughter, and Elinor helped her with the same precise, thoughtful attention she brought to everything, recommending a novel and wrapping it in brown paper and tying it with string. Julian opened the first letter, the one from the 15th of October, 1808. The Crocuses letter? No, that came later. The first letter was short, just a few lines. "Dear Julian, the Crocuses are late this year." He read it slowly. He read it the way it was meant to be read, not as one of 5,000, not as part of a flood, but as a single day, a single moment of attention, a single act of love offered freely to a man who was not there. He read it, and then he set it aside, and he did not pick up the next one. Not yet. He sat in the chair and looked at the shop, the crowded shelves, the sleeping cat, the woman behind the counter with ink on her hands. And he understood that this was what Elinor was offering him. Not forgiveness, not reunion, not the restoration of what they had lost. She was offering him time, the chance to sit in her shop, in her world, in the life she had built without him, and read the letters he had missed, one at a time, at the pace they were written. A letter a day, 5,000 days, 15 years. She was giving him the chance to live the life he had missed, not the life itself. That was gone, irretrievable, as gone as the girl at the ruined chapel and the young man on the ship. But the record of it, the monument, the cathedral of attention that Elinor had built, one letter at a time, out of crocuses and robins and thunderstorms and the relentless, magnificent ordinary. He would sit in this chair every day. He would read one letter every day. He would drink the tea she gave him and listen to the bell above the door and watch her sell books and talk to customers and live. Live the way she had always lived, fully, attentively, without waiting for anyone. And maybe, after 5,000 days, after he had read every letter, after he had lived, in paper and ink, the 15 years he had missed, maybe then he would deserve to know her. Not the girl she had been, the woman she was, the woman who had followed her own advice, the woman who had lived. The afternoon light slanted through the shop window. The cat stretched and yawned and settled back to sleep. A customer came in and asked for Montaigne, and Elinor pointed to a shelf and said, "Third from the left, second row. The annotated one is better. It has marginalia worth more than the text." Julian smiled. Not a large smile. Not the laugh she remembered, the sudden, unexpected burst of sound. Just a small, private smile, directed at no one, seen by no one. He picked up the second letter. He read it slowly. Outside, the day went on. The village moved through its ordinary rhythms, the baker sweeping his step, the children walking home from school, the old woman with the cat who could predict rain. The seasons would turn, the crocuses would come, the robins would nest. The light would hit the hills at evening and turn the stone gold. And in the bookshop, two people who had once been in love, who had been separated by duty and distance and 15 years of silence, sat in the same room, not touching, not speaking, connected by nothing except 5,000 letters and the slow, patient work of reading them. She had forgiven him, not in a single act, not in a dramatic declaration or a tearful embrace. She had forgiven him by outliving her need for him, by building a life so full, so complete, so rich with attention and purpose, and the daily practice of noticing that his absence had become not a wound, but a feature of the landscape, a gap in the hedge, a space where something used to be, now grown over with wildflowers. She did not need him. That was the gift. That was the freedom. She did not need him. And because she did not need him, she could let him sit in her shop and read her letters and drink her tea, and it cost her nothing. It was not sacrifice. It was not compromise. It was generosity. The generosity of a woman who had so much life that she could afford to share a corner of it with the man who had once been the center of everything and was now just a man in a chair, reading letters, learning to pay attention. 5,000 letters, one a day, 15 years of catching up. He had time. She had tea. The cat had books to sleep on. It was enough